Welcome to the Delicate Fire podcast. And today we are bringing on Forrest Landry, my mentor, my friend, my confidant, and someone that I truly so deeply inspired by and so happy to be doing this with. I'm so glad, Forrest, that you've chosen to endeavor on this podcast with me. And I'm just really glad to know you. So thank you.
Well, thank you. I mean, you've made this possible, and I really appreciate it. This invitation and the willingness to explore all of this and to be interested. I mean, I appreciate the friendship, and I've been delighted to do this work with you as well.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So, how did I get here? What's the story of just arriving at talking about effective choice and where the aphorisms come from and that sort of thing. So I guess it goes back to when I was a teenager. I had at that point, through my father, who's a woodworker, experienced real hands-on engineering sort of skills, like, measuring things and calculating angles and designing furniture and working on a lathe and all sorts of things like that. And so I had this sort of very practical engineering experience. But at the same time, I also had an extremely rich inner world and was very, very sensitive to the environment, the qualities of the space and sounds and smells and so on. And so on one hand, I have this incredibly numinous, sort of energetic, sort of esoteric experience of reality. And at the same time, I also have this profoundly disciplined, rigorous, mathematical, engineering, physical sort of understanding. And so I wanted to find a way to really have the benefits of each support the other. To bring a kind of discipline or intellectual rigor from this sort of engineering mindset into this sort of esoteric sensory experiential space, sort of intuitive dimension. And at the same time, to bring the sort of qualities of the intuitive dimension as a sort of energy and infusion of benefit into the, what should we build kind of thing. So, in effect, it's kind of like operating as an artist. I wanted to basically be doing things in the world in a way that helped to create the sort of qualities or experiences that I was, first of all, desiring to have and wanting to create for others as well. So at some point, I started to really look at a lot of the traditions of the world, a lot of the philosophy of the world, a lot of the what have people done to sort of bring these sort of esoteric concepts and these sort of practical concepts together. And so, obviously science will talk about one thing and so on, but these esoteric sort of literature, this sort of mysticism kind of literature was trying to basically talk about this other thing. And is there something out there that talked about both and in a way that you could relate them, kind of in this sort of co-supporting way that I was describing. And so I spent a lot of time searching, probably a couple of years, really focusing on that. At a certain point, I started to realize that actually there really wasn't anything out there that did this sort of connection between these two fields. And that if I wanted that I would have to undertake to create that. That in effect that I see the need, and so therefore I should be responsible for creating the thing that is this connection between these two aspects. So this all sort of came to a focus when I was 16. And I made a commitment to knowing that this was going to be something that really was essentially a different kind of knowledge, a different kind of process and experience to even acquire that sort of knowledge, that in effect, that there was a sense in which I would have to prepare myself to be a fit vehicle to receive something like that. Like, if I can't notice an answer, like say I'm asking the wrong question and therefore, somebody hands me the answer to the question I really should have been asking, I won't recognize that as an answer because I'm asking the wrong question. So this sense of become a fit container, become a person who's asking the right questions. Like, what do I need to transform about myself so that I can do this work? The level of commitment that it was involved has to be total. I mean, it's like you can't really agree to change yourself a little bit to become something. Like you have to be willing to do whatever it takes, essentially.
Yeah.
And so, I'm kind of soft pedaling the extremity of that, but honestly, this was a very serious thing. And so that willingness or that openness or that interior sort of meditation process that really started to shape me as a person, that was sort of the beginning of the journey, basically. Like I had learned a lot of stuff prior to that, and I knew a lot of things. There's a lot of stuff I couldn't even account for how I know those things. Like there's sort of these dimensions of process which even today I wouldn't be able to tell you, how did I know that this was the thing to do, or how did I know that this particular variety of meditation was the thing to do, or where did I learn these sorts of things? Like it certainly wasn't in any of the books I was reading. And it certainly wasn't in any of the people that I knew or grew up with. There's no real example or exemplar of this in my family tree if I look back at that. So there's mysteries here that I don't even myself have the answer to. Like there's aspects of where did this come from, which I personally can only speculate. But I can say that sort of orientation and whatever situational circumstances, the fact that it was the 90s and the internet was just getting going, meaning that I started to be able to have more access to a lot more articles on a lot more topics and could start to think about using machine automation to do some of the organization of this stuff. Like all of these things sort of combined. And so I entered into just a level of intensity of experience that, yeah, I don't even have anywhere close to the language to describe the sheer level of both intensity and profundity of the kinds of things that started to happen at that moment, or over the you know next few years. Essentially, on one hand, there was a lot of things going on in my life. I was homeless briefly, and I started going to school at university, and I ended up working for this company called Digital Equipment Corporation, and ended up developing some real skills as a software engineer. I did some significant projects around that time, which sort of cemented my career. I managed to become well known in the Boston area as a very high level software engineer, and able to do some really remarkable things. I started to really kind of live this sort of two-phase life. I'd spend 6 months working on the metaphysics, developing this research, moving it forward, right? And then the other 6 months I'd just spend working as a software engineer, as a contractor, and I'd earn enough to basically live on for the other 6 months. So in effect, I was basically back and forth between these sort of two modes. And I was commuting back and forth long distances because I had this little cabin in Maine. A friend of mine was renting to me. It was on this thing called Little Purgatory Lake. Like literally that's its name, Little Purgatory Lake. And it was pretty rustic too. I mean, it was like, think cabin in the woods with, a little stove, and the plumbing is frozen solid. So you have to drain all the water out before winter starts. So to do things in the bathroom, for example, I have to go out onto the lake with a pickaxe and an ice pick and cut a hole through like 2 feet of ice to get a 5-gallon pail to get water to bring back to the bathroom. So, on one hand, it was interesting because, I had a dial-up connection and a bunch of computers, and the rest of the cabin was like this really very kind of basic experience. Anyways, that was, kind of part of the experience of just what it was to be doing this sort of work. So I was living a very frugal life. I was doing pretty well as a software engineer, but I was only taking contracts. I wasn't taking permanent positions. In a real sense, the metaphysics kind of came into focus through the 90s. And the publication of the sort of mother manuscript of which all the rest of this stuff is kind of built on or based on came into completion mostly 2000, 2001. Like that was the first release of what I colloquially call the white book. It's called the Immanent Metaphysics, basically. And there's various versions of this book. So basically one of them was sort of designed to be kind of minimalist and written more for academics. And the aphorisms of effective choice came out of this book called The Effective Choice, which is essentially the latter half of this sort of primary manuscript, or it's a section out of the manuscript, really. And so it just took a long time to basically do the underlying research, to identify the modalities and the axioms, and to kind of get to the point where this thing was coherent enough to be presentable as a complete thing. And in terms of my original commitment to find a way to join this sort of engineering sense and this sort of esoteric, more artful symbolism, meaning-oriented, relevance-oriented dimension of life, well, be careful what you ask for, because in this case, that actually really happened. I mean, it wasn't like, I made this sort of thing. Hey, I'd like to take these two ingredients and put them together with some real seriousness, some real purpose behind that. And then to have that actually happen in a way that, well, not only was I personally preparing myself to be transformed, but I was fundamentally transformed. And now there's a sense in which not only do I understand how those things fit together, but it's actually impossible for me to think about. I mean, I can see through the eyes of people who don't have that understanding. I mean, I can understand what it was like before to some extent.
Mm-hmm.
So I can relate to people from that perspective. But honestly, yeah, there's a real difference before and after.
Mm-hmm.
Like if you look at Ken Wilber's thing, like the pre-trans fallacy, that's like a real deal. I mean, he articulated that super well, which is basically to say, before he used the word enlightenment, I don't particularly prefer that language, but there is a sense in which you undergo a shift in perspective that is so profound, especially because it has to do with the nature of the essence of perception itself, the essence of being itself. So, in this sense, metaphysics is like the study of, well, there's three classical words: ontology, epistemology, axiology. And what these really are is ontology is the study of what is. Epistemology is the study of how do we know? Like, how do we know what is? How do we know anything at all? And then finally, axiology can be thought of as like, why does it matter? What do we care about? What are values? And what's virtue, essentially? So in effect, there's a sense of what is, how do we know, and why do we care? Those are like the three questions. And so in effect, that sense of what is and knowing and caring are as profoundly transformed by this way of thinking and being, expressing, as is possible. Right? Like if you push up right against the limit of what is actual, and you push up right against the limit of like the maximum of a notion of abstraction, like the very notion of abstraction itself. And at the same time, this sort of other pole, which I can only describe as essentially symbolic, different than abstract. This sort of connotative, qualitative, ephemeral dimension, which can't be understood in forms the same way that abstraction and forms kind of correlate. And then there's, as I said, this sort of immediate, concrete, first person, here and now, this versus this that did happen rather than that could have happened. That these qualities, these aspects, these relationships, these forms, these dynamics, the very notion of process itself is fully cohered by this metaphysics, by this dynamic. And so in that sense, the merger of the things that I had originally thought was not only accomplished, but 1,000 times more was accomplished. And so in effect, the thing we call the non-relativistic ethics, which if that was the only thing I had accomplished in my philosophical career, would have been preeminent in the sense of like, yeah, I am completely satisfied that I have already done the most meaningful thing I will ever do, was a side effect of this axiomatic foundational relationship aspect, relationship process. And so, yeah, I did not come out of this the same person that went into it, although in one sense, it's a bit like that, chop wood and carry water. Before you chop wood and carry water, and then you go through this beyond description thing. And then afterwards, you are still a human being. You're still mortal. You're still going to live a life with regular people and have friends and do all the rest of the stuff, right? So in effect, the chop wood and carry water afterwards I tell you from firsthand experience, that is extremely real. That is like actually the way it is. So the point here though is that in terms of my own relationship to this, on one hand, I can say it came through me. It changed me. I am to some extent in some sort of intimate relationship with this, but it isn't. I mean, it's of me in one sense, but I can't hold it as about me. Right. I mean, it's something that, in the same sort of way that astrophysics isn't about specifically the moon, the earth, and the sun, although you can understand the relationships between the earth, the moon, and the sun with, these concepts of gravity and rotation and orbits and so on. Really, it talks about anything in the universe that happens to be affected by these sorts of fields and dynamics. So there's a kind of underlying theory that is expressed in the practice that we see of everything in the universe. It's not, and just to be super clear, it's not a theory of everything. It's not pretending to try to describe everything there is. The only thing it is trying to describe actually is the essence. So in other words, it basically says we can talk about the foundations of things in a completely coherent way. And you can build on that. You can use those understandings to do things like translate between what might be a psychological theory to see that there are similar structures in say, chemistry or physics, or some aspects of music theory or mathematics, or like basically it gives you a way to move from what might seem like human-centric concerns in, say, anthropology or sociology, for example, and find ways to understand those in terms of metaphors that it would really make sense to someone who is basically studying maybe microchip manufacturing. Like, not to say that one is the other, they're not, but it is to say that whatever learnings, whatever deep learnings that you've developed in any field of, if you've gone into any field of specialization and really gotten down to what is the essence of that field of study, like if you've gone into something like Christianity or Islam, or I don't know, pick Buddhism or whatever religion, doesn't even matter, right? Like the fact is that if you study the very essence, like what is it that makes that worldview operable, coherent as a worldview? Like if you get into sort of like the original, deepest concepts that effectively infuse all of the specific understandings of whatever tradition, whatever field of study. And again, I'm not just talking about philosophical things or cultural things, but also talking about very practical things. That in effect, there's now a sense in which you can kind of see that it isn't just that they have the same form kind of coincidentally. It's that the aspects of these deepest elements have the same form because they cannot not be that. And so in effect, there's a sense here in which you can come into direct apprehension of that. And it's intense. It's really intense. It's worth it. It's profoundly worth it. Not an easy path, but once you've gone through that, your capacities are enormous. Like you can now contemplate and to think about how to solve problems at way larger scales than otherwise you could. Like, Einstein, there's this quote that he wanted to know the mind of God. And I don't think that in his life he ever really felt that he had achieved that, but he certainly got pretty damn far, right? Like general relativity is no joke. I mean, that's like, people hold him as an esteemed figure for a reason. And there's a sense here in which, he was striving for this thing. And I can't not recognize the sort of impetus of really wanting to know and wanting to do whatever it takes, right? Imagine what his firsthand experience would have been if he had actually had that happen. And, just like try to imagine being Einstein and understanding general relativity for the first time and realizing how impactful that could really be in the world. Like what a difference that, and his work in quantum mechanics, for example, and all of the stuff that came from that. I mean, people credit him with E equals mc squared, which led to the atomic revolution, good and bad, right? We have energy, but we also have weapons. And so there's a sense in which you can use radiation to cure cancer, but you can also use it to cause cancer. So in effect, there's, this mixed bag of just the profundity of the outcome associated with a really fundamental idea of E equals mc squared, which is directly descended from general relativity. If you're in the firsthand position of being involved with ideas like that, then you come to sort of realize that, yeah, these things really do matter. You can't not know yourself that something like the ethics is important. It's important for the world. It's a tool that will allow us to answer questions that actually matter at the most profound and at the same time broadest scales at the same time, right? Wide and deep.
Mhm.
And so in effect, there's just kind of a shock and awe experience that goes with that honestly now 30 years later, I mean, it hasn't gotten any less for me, even though this is my firsthand relationship is this actually happened in my personal life. So in one sense, you come into this sort of awareness of, okay, well, the best thing that I can try to do is to convey this to people in some way that they can relate to. So, at first it was write the book, just write it down. And then it was, try to find versions of this that are easier for more ordinary people to relate to. So, the white book led to the effective choice. And then the effective choice was like, okay, well, this is sort of a spiritual way of thinking about things. So you don't have to be a hard materialist. You can relate to it from an artistic dimension or just from a firsthand, I'm living my life, what's useful to me to know kind of thing, right? And so that was the impetus between the effective choice book. And of course, there was the other book that was more written for people who maybe had a more academic interest in philosophy, for example, although I wasn't really trying to write from within that world nor to influence that world because I needed enough freedom to just pursue this course of research in the first place. I didn't really want to be beholden to anybody asking permission to ask a question that I knew mattered.
Right.
So in this sense, I needed a little bit of space in order to do this work. Funding it myself and doing it myself firsthand, so on and so forth, was really the best way to ensure that happened. So in one sense, the aphorisms of effective choice book became kind of the first thing that I could hand out to just people and to just give them and say, take a look, and to just sort of hope that they would notice that, first of all, the book isn't written like other philosophy books. It's, most philosophy books are frankly a pain in the ass to read. Like you need to learn a specialized language, and they are tomes. Like they imprison you. Tomes that are tombs, right? I mean, it's like, I have a lot of sympathy for people who were studying philosophy in, say, university and just being overwhelmed with the sheer amount of text. And so I swore I would not do that to anybody. And the key moment came when I'll tell you this little story. I was flying back and forth to Washington because I was working at the Pentagon. It was early in that period of time. I mean, there's stories within stories, but okay. So I won't tell you how I ended up basically doing work at the Pentagon, but there was there's this need for me to fly back and forth. And so I'm driving into a parking lot in somewhere around Hartford. And I want to catch a shuttle to get on the plane and so on. And I pull up to there's these little booths where there's a tenant. He's sitting in this tiny building with glass, all around, and you pull up and he hands you a ticket that you put on your dash or something like that, right? And I mean, this is one of those stories. It's just a bit surreal in itself. So I forgive you if it doesn't make sense. But so I pull up to this window and I look up at this guy, and it's some Indian person. And I look at him and he looks at me, and we just had this moment of just recognition. It was like, I can't quite explain, but it was like, we didn't need to say anything. It was just like, I see you and I know that you see me, and I'm seeing you and I know that you're seeing me. And it was just like, it was wordless. It was just like this immediate understanding. And bear in mind, there's now a car pulling up behind me. We have all of about maybe 10 seconds. And he says, I've been carrying this book all of my life. This is my only copy. I've been studying this for 40 years. I feel moved in this moment to give this to you, okay? And I take it and I say thank you. And then I pull forward because I have to, right? Because, there's the world is still happening, right? So the guy behind me is not going to wait. He's going to start honking in a second, right? And we all know, like, we both know all of this, right? Like there's the whole thing of there's no explanation needed. So I just basically, I acknowledge him in the sense of the gift of which he has just given me. And I still have the book. And I remember I took it with me and I put it on the plane. And when I got on the plane, that was the first opportunity I had to open it up. And it was written in aphorism form. It was a whole bunch of just sayings. Now, here's the rest of the story. The thing is that in the 3 or 4 months prior to that point, I was starting to try to write all of my research results in essay form. And I had written a bunch of essays, and I had to write them in a somewhat intellectual style. And I was just finding myself handcuffed by this. It was like, this is not working. And I need some other form. I need some other way to express the essence of what this is that's way more compact. And so I opened up the book and I started reading these things, and they were in aphorism form. And it was like the light went on. It was like, this is the form that I need to write this in. And that changed everything, because it was like, after I got back from my flight, I was a few days, I came back and I sat down at the computer. I put all the essays in a folder. I don't even think I kept it. I might have even deleted them. Right. And I started with all of my notes, and I converted my notes, which were in EGS form, into aphorism form. I just basically made a 1-to-1 translation of the keynotes. So even though EGS is about 5-to-1 density relative to really good, solid academic prose, I basically cut something like 12-to-1 from my notes to aphorisms. And that still ended up being a book that was several hundred pages, but the density factor was through the roof. But that was the right way to move, because it moved the project from completely intractable. No way in hell that this could even be published, because it would be like an encyclopedia set. There's no way, right? So I'm thinking to myself, okay, this moved it into a space where it could actually be done.
Mm.
So that Indian gentleman, who, by the way, I never met again. I went back. He had taken the job recently, and he left it shortly thereafter. So he had put himself in my path to hand this thing to me, and after that, his mission was done, basically, as far as I could see. I mean, like I have no idea anything about his story. I don't know anything about him. I don't even know his name, right? And but the thing is that there was a sense in which that was the answer I was looking for. It's like, the movie Back to the Future, where, the guy has gone back in time and he's playing some rock and roll from the future. And then there's a call made and he says, that sound you were looking for, listen to this. And he puts it up and it's like, yeah, that's it. That's what I'm looking for. Well, that book showing me aphorism was my experience of that. It was like, this is what it needs to be. So the aphorisms that were in the book itself were very beautiful, very expressive of that particular version of Hindu tradition. I mean, perfectly meaningful, perfectly valid, but not my work. So none of them made it into anything that I published. But what did make it in was the idea of an aphorism. And so in this sense, it made it possible for me to now publish a philosophical work with a level of clarity that I personally could tolerate. And moreover, that I could trust that my readers could tolerate, given that I didn't want to subject them to 100-page tomes, 1,000-page tomes, actually. I have had people who are my friends basically say, yeah, I really love the way you write, and it's transformed the way that I read everything else.
Yeah.
For me, that's one of the higher compliments. I mean, it's like that's a deeply meaningful compliment when a philosopher basically says, you've transformed the way I understand philosophy, and you've raised the standard of what it means to write well at the same time. And so I feel like, yeah, that moment when that thing was handed to me and I could see that was the way to go, that was it. That's what made it what it is, was that experience. The aphorisms of effective choice became essentially my version of that book that was handed to me, that are essentially things to live by that I could hand to someone else in that same way. And so I did. I've handed out thousands of copies of the Effective Choice book, and in fact, even more copies. So I then made an extract of this aphorisms of, like, first it was the book, The Effective Choice. Then it was, I extracted from that an even smaller book called The Tiny Book of Essential Wisdom. And I've given away like 5,000 copies of that, or actually closer to 7,500, because Neurohacker did they did a print run of it and gave it to all their customers as well. And I see them still. I mean, occasionally I visit a friend or somebody and there's a copy of it in their bathroom or something. They read it, or someone will walk up to me and something will happen and they'll take it out of their purse and they'll say, yeah, I have a copy of this. They've been carrying it around with them for like months or years. So it was small enough. I mean, it was like, basically, two matchbox put side to side. And that's roughly the size of the book. And I need to get it back in print. Honestly, it's like, this is a task we need to do.
Definitely.
But then adjacent to that, I had for my company, for the staff of my company, I wanted to create a version of it that would be useful to them to use in their lives in a setting that was still relevant to business. So that's where the aphorisms of effective choice came from. So this is what we're teaching from, is now, essentially the result of all of these sort of movements, these extraction processes to try to make it more available to a public of a particular type. And, just in the genuine, sincere desire for that to actually be useful for them in their lives, the same way that, I found it in my life as a sort of side effect of these even deeper currents that themselves have this profoundly practical, artistic dimension. So that's where all this came from. That's kind of how all this came about. I mean, there's obviously a lot more stories, but that's maybe one of the sort of through lines, at least as I experience it individually.
Beautiful, Forrest. Thank you so much for that arc. I mean, I'm really touched to be able to, it feels very surreal to be able to hear this from you and to actually be able to put this out into the world together. It's been so meaningful in my own life, and I've seen it work so deeply in the lives of a lot of my friends and people that I've connected with. And it just feels really, really meaningful to be doing this with you. So thank you, Forrest.
You're welcome. Glad to help.
Great. And I'll see you next week.